there's some names in that reading, aren't there? I did warn Tracy to pick someone that could have a stab at that, and you did a great job. So thank you so much, Julie, for having a stab at that. Now, each summer, when I was aged 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, my brother and I would be dropped off by my parents in their Ford Capri car in a lay-by. It was a very tatty Ford Capri. They would then drive off, and then this either Rolls-Royce or Bentley would turn up, and we would rather excitedly climb in to meet our granddad, who would then drive us off to his estate. The barrier would raise, we would drive down the 1-mile drive, our excitement rising, to his mansion, where we would spend a week each summer. We would swim in his pool, we would wander through his woodlands, we would have the time of our lives. And I was only slightly aware of a little bit of a split in the family. I remember one day asking my mum, how is it that we've got a tatty Ford Capri and my dad's brother drives a posh Porsche? And over time, she began to explain something of the rift in the family, which would explain why we were dropped off and they drove off and then we were picked up and taken. Hadn't really thought that was a bit odd when I was about 8. She explained how it started with an ugly divorce between my granddad and my nan, and how money can poison lives. Now, bear in mind, we were quite poor at the time. I mean, we could afford a car, but relatively hard up. And Grandad explained to my mum, she was recounting this to me, how he was anxious about money. And her jaw nearly dropped. Tried to keep herself composed as she listened. And he explained how he's in farming. And farming's very up and down. And if he wasn't able to buy a new Range Rover every other year, his peers would notice. And he felt under incredible pressure to keep up this image and this lifestyle. And he became trapped. He became a slave to it, really. What had started off as a good thing in his life had become a God thing, and that God thing had become a slave master to him. And that is a key lesson in the book of Judges. As one author writes, whatever controls us is really our God. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. The person who seeks acceptance is controlled by the people that he or she wants to please. We do not control ourselves. We're controlled by the Lord of our life. And so we live and work amongst a variety of gods. Not only those gods of formal religions, but also the gods of wealth, celebrity, pleasure, ideology, achievement, and so on. Our era could be characterized by the repeated phrase that comes up in the book of Judges and sums up the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And each time, those people found themselves trapped, enslaved. And the book of Judges will keep asking us these questions. Which gods are clamoring for your attention? Which God will you choose to serve? Will that God bring freedom or slavery? And so as we begin a short series looking at the first half of the book of Judges, we'll see that despite a gap of 3,000 years between ourselves and God's people back then, our society has much in common with the lives of those people who lived between the time of Moses and Joshua on one hand and the era of the first kings like David and Solomon on the other hand. Now, the Bible is made up of 66 mini books. There's 66 books in the Bible, and some of them are history books, some of them are poetry books, some of them are wisdom, some are prophecy, Some are law, and so on. And they're split into the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the book of Judges is one of the books in the Old Testament. And it begins with Joshua's death. And it covers somewhere between 200 to 400 years. We're not quite sure because it's unclear as to whether one judge dies and another judge starts, or whether the judges overlap with each other. Now, a question for you. There are 6 major judges and 6 minor judges in the book of Judges. You may not have ever heard of any of them, and that's absolutely fine. You may have heard or remember some of them. Can any of you name any of the judges from the book of Judges? Othniel. Very good. First judge. That's today's judge. Deborah. Very good. Samson. Yeah. Gideon. Number 4. Yeah. So we've got 4 of the 6 major judges. Any more? The others are quite hard to remember. Nearly. Ehud, and Jephthah. That's the 6 major judges. I don't know the names of the minor judges, but I'll read them to you. Ibzan, Abdon, Tola, Jair, and Shamgar, and Elon. Sound familiar? Anyone name their kids those? So they're the names of the judges, and all the drama of this book takes place in the promised land, Canaan, which was approximately 150 miles long and 70 miles wide. I don't know if that's too small, but in red are the names of the judges, and the major judges are underlined. And you can see that Othniel, maybe you can see it, is right at the bottom in the south. And that's where we're starting today with the first judge of the book. And when you think of judges, that might help actually. When you think of judges, think less of a courtroom judge and more of a tribal chieftain. Because these were like regional strong men or women who were raised up by God when and where needed. And so the narrator, whilst the narrator still calls them judges of the whole of Israel, and not just of their tribe, and their influence may therefore have just been regional. So we're looking at Othniel today in the south, and what happened in the south might not have been heard about immediately in the north. Each deliverance was a testimony to God's covenant faithfulness, his promised faithfulness to the whole people. And that's why they're known as judges of the whole of Israel, even though each one of them, their influence may not have been known about and felt at the time to all the people. Does that make a little bit of sense as to how they operated? And our series is going to focus on 4 of the major judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, and Gideon. And we're starting today with Othniel in the south. Now, a few years ago, friends of ours invited me and Kirsten around for games, and our games host began explaining the first game. And I had a lot of questions. She said, "Let's just start playing it and you'll pick it up." Whoa, 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 I said. I'm not going to start a competitive game without knowing all of the parameters, all of the rules, what I can do, what I can't do, because I'll be disadvantaged. And she just laughed at me and told me to get on with it. So we had to roll the dice, play the game, figure it out as we go along. Not my comfort zone. But the book of Judges is a little bit like that. In the first couple of chapters, the narrator explains the principles of the book. It kind of gives an overview. This is a bit like what the book of Judges is. You're going to read it in a much more detail as we go. And then, the first round of the game, we meet Othniel. And it's a very small story, a very short story. And it's like, here's how it goes. There's a cycle that's repeated throughout the book of Judges, and you'll get to see that cycle with Othniel, but just really in its bare bones. And then as we read through Judges, the stories get a bit bigger, a bit more involved, flesh gets added to the bones, and momentum begins to build. That's how it is. So today I'm going to share with you a few principles of the book of Judges, and then we'll have a look at Othniel as a kind of a way, an example to get our heads around some of these principles. And over the next couple of weeks or so, we'll add to it and momentum will grow. We'll cover similar ground, but in more depth, and you'll see it from different angles. But let's take a step back for a moment. What had led to this point of the Israelites' lives as they reach and start living in the promised land? As you may know, Israel had been enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt. And the people cried out to God, and he raised up Moses as their deliverer to lead them out of slavery. And it was Moses' successor, Joshua, who had the privilege of leading Israel into the promised land, Canaan. This was the land that God's people, Israel, could settle, could become God's distinctive community, and be a light and a blessing to all nations, witnessing to God's loving faithfulness to them. Well, that was the plan anyway. But the Canaanites is a term that really represents all the different tribes of people that already lived in Canaan. The Canaanites were already living there, and that was the first hurdle to overcome. And Israel was really fickle towards God. That was the second hurdle. So the Canaanites worshipped a variety of gods, and they had some pretty gory practices. God had said to Israel in Deuteronomy, "You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods." That's pretty heavy. We can see why God doesn't want his people to be tainted by these people. And God has said in Exodus, "I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you." And Joshua, who'd brought Israel into Canaan to start this initiative, reminds the people on his deathbed, "Decide today whom you will serve. As for my family and me, we will serve the Lord. He will tolerate no rivals." He will tolerate no rivals. And our story in Judges chapter 3 picks up the narrative from there, one generation later. So let's see how they're doing. Julie read it to us. Let me go over some of it with you. Verse 5. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Oh man, that's not a good start. Now, the church today does not have a mandate to live in isolation from the world as the Israelites had just then. Our calling as a church is to live in the world, but not of the world. And it's not being in the world that ruins us, but letting the world get into us. Just as ships sink, not by being in the water, but by the water getting into them. So just how much of Canaanite culture got into God's people? The writer of Psalm 106 testifies, "They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to false gods. By their deeds they prostituted themselves. They were bent on religion and they wasted away in their sin." So after a while they started doing the same things that God hated. And like an unfaithful partner in marriage, the Israelites turned their back on God and gave their devotion to other gods. Joshua had spoken of God's fierce jealousy, that he would tolerate no rivals. And rightly so. If a wife is unfaithful to her husband and he simply shrugs his shoulders, that shows that he doesn't care. He has no real love for her. But if he was fiercely jealous, deeply upset and angry, you'd know how much that relationship means to him, how deep his love runs. And that's what we have here. In Judges 3, it reads this in verse 7. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. The Israelites were quickly distracted. On this occasion, they looked to the Canaanites' fertility gods for their security. This involved going with temple prostitutes, as if such actions would encourage the male god Baal and his female counterpart, Asherah, to make love. And then they believed the rain, the grain, the wine, and the oil would flow again. And in consequence of their faithlessness, God hands them over to a ruler called Cushan-Rishathaim, whose name means double wickedness. Perhaps a pun, perhaps not his real name, but symbolic of the severity of the entrapment and slavery that Israel had got themselves into. Was that it then for Israel? I mean, they'd blown it, hadn't they? Is it game over? Let's read on, verse 9. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who served them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave him Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. God has the power to use military powers as he desires. No matter how powerful this Cushan-Rishathaim considered himself to be, he's like sand in the hands of God. But following deliverance, relief, and peace, we have verse 12. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so the cycle repeats. As the book of Judges continues, we see this cycle repeated. Disobedience, the people of Israel disobey God's commands, and then distress. They feel the weight of their oppression and suffering, the consequence of their disobedience, which leads them to despair. You'll notice sometimes that they just cry out to God. Other times it sounds like they're repenting. We're not quite sure if they're repenting every time or if they're just crying out in their suffering. And either way, after a period of time, God raises up a deliverer and delivers them from their oppression. And then there is often, but not always, peace. And then the cycle goes again. The Israelites were bent on rebellion, that's what we're told. This wasn't a one-off. The cycle goes and goes and goes. Many times they turned their back on God and went after foreign gods. Again, Psalm 106 says, many times he rescued them. He remembered his covenant, that's his promise, with them. And he relented by the abundance of his loving devotion. So we start to get to see something in the book of Judges of the depravity, the corruption of the human heart, how our hearts are bent towards rebelling against God, and yet God's unwavering faithfulness and love towards his people. What the book of Judges doesn't explain is how can a holy God, a God who is so fair and just, overlook that his people are bent on rebellion and prostitute themselves to other gods? The book of Judges, as you'll see, will bring to before us many examples of despicable people doing deplorable things. With heroes, if we can call them that, who are deeply flawed, more and more flawed as the book goes on. And the nation becomes more and more morally corrupt. Well, the book highlights this trait in each one of us. And this is where we can try and open ourselves up and be honest in this series. It highlights that despite God's unwavering faithfulness and love, his kindness, his devotion towards us, our hearts are naturally bent on rebellion against him, Our hearts are drawn towards the gods of our age. Wealth, celebrity, pleasure, ideology, achievement, comfort, affirmation, romance, and others. And what start out as good things, many of these things are good things, we allow them to become God things. And when they become God things, we often discover they've become our slave masters. Now, if you know me, you'll know that sport is a good thing in my life. But I've got to keep it in check, otherwise it teeters over into a God thing. I've shared with you before, a few years ago, I was on the verge of signing a contract with a cycling coach to get into racing. And the emails back and forth, they wouldn't go through. I couldn't get the contract, I couldn't sign it. I gave up and I got in the car, I had to drive to work. And as I was driving, I heard the closest thing to an audible voice of God. Simply said, "Don't race. Don't race." I said, "Okay." And then I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders. Often good things become God things, and we need saving from ourselves, saving from whatever it is that our hearts are reaching out for and redirecting to God, who is the only one who can truly satisfy our heart's desires. Each judge, each deliverer in this book has significant limitations and significant flaws. Othniel's limitation was simply his mortality. We're not told much more about him than that, but we're told he died. He couldn't live forever. And when his influence was over, the Israelites once again plunged into faithlessness and moral corruption. Othniel's mortality and time-limited reign points us to Jesus, who defeated death and whose reign will never end. Now, as we come to land, I'll just point out this to you. The limitations and flaws of each judge that we come across will point us to the true judge, Jesus Christ, God in human form, who demonstrated just how far God would go for a people who continually pursue and are enslaved by other gods. Jesus Christ, the one and only who warrants our exclusive devotion. Jesus Christ, the one and only who delivers us from slavery and invites us into freedom. I hope that's whet your appetites a little bit to meet Jesus, our ultimate deliverer in the pages of Judges. Let's give ourselves just 2 minutes to consider the questions I posed at the start. Which gods are clamoring for your attention? Which God will you choose to serve? Which God, or will that God, bring freedom and slavery? Freedom or slavery? Will that God bring freedom or slavery? Let's think for a moment.